Good afternoon. We're here at the Peatland Pavilion on the last Friday of COP26. So here in the IUCN, many other organizations, Peatland Pavilion, we've had now 2 weeks of fascinating sessions discussing the science, the policy, the practice, and the finance of peatland ecosystems and their restoration, the contribution that that can make to addressing the climate crisis, the nature crisis, and many other benefits besides. In this session, we're going to address peatland rights and cultures. Earlier this morning, we had sessions led by Iceland and also led by Ireland, with speakers from Mongolia through to many countries in Europe. And one of the words that came up continuously is stakeholder, community, the need to engage with the people who live and use peatlands, live around peatlands, if we're to have successful restoration projects. So this session focuses absolutely on those people, on those communities, and particularly in the context of the northern peatlands, where after forests were already cut down, peat was often used as a source of fuel, and in some cases still is. So in the session today, you'll hear from participants from Canada, from Ireland, from England, and from Scotland, talking about how we understand peatlands as communities, how we use peatlands, and how that understanding and use can change in future to include the need for restoration. With speakers from researchers, users, community representatives from all of those countries. And I'm really pleased that we can bring you a set of voices that we haven't heard so frequently at COP. Of course, we also have that strand of science. What's the evidence underpinning our understanding of communities and of the peatlands that they use? So we have this represented both in social sciences and in natural sciences. Here around us in the Peatland Pavilion, it's the end of COP. The numbers of participants swirling around the corridors is beginning to drop. And this is the second last event in the whole of the series. So we're looking forward to a closing series, but don't feel that you are any less important now. This event, we hope, is going to be one in which these voices are rolled into future years of Peatland Pavilion activity in COP. With that, I'll end and pass over to our first speaker. Dr. Klaus Glenk leads the Sustainable Ecosystems team at Scotland's Rural College, a higher education institution which has sites across Scotland and focuses on training and also engagement and consultancy, advising landowners how to use their land. And Klaus is going to talk to us about the community's understanding of peat. Klaus, over to you. Are we hearing you?
Thank you very much, Andrew, for the kind introduction and also for the opportunity to speaking today. I really look forward to this session. I've been really lucky over the past decade or so to work with my much valued colleagues, Anja Big, Paula Novo, and Julia Martino Ortega on the socioeconomics of peatlands. And I also want to extend a special thanks to the research partners at Nature Scott and the Peatland Action Program there, with whom we've been collaborating over the past several years. So the insights that I want to share today are based on our joint research regarding perceptions and values of peatland in Scotland. And the work really builds on the premise that views and values of stakeholders, including the public, should be accounted for in conservation, but also in kind of wider land use policy. Now, about 10 years ago, we started our research on the socioeconomics of peatlands, and that was a time when there was an increasing attention on peatland management and how it could be used to address environmental challenges. And we wanted to work with the public, and our initial plans were often met with quite a bit of a degree of skepticism by some. And perhaps this really came from a widespread belief that the public would know very little about peatlands and that people would not care about them beyond maybe in some rural areas in which peat extraction, grazing on peatlands were rather common. So that people would rather perceive also maybe peatlands as dangerous or bleak places following some common reports of walkers and animals that got stuck or lost. So it seemed to us that ignorance in the public about peatlands was something that was more commonly assumed. And to a degree, that's also reflected in the 2015 National Peatland Plan for Scotland. As you know, there's an ambition really to raise awareness about the benefits of healthy peatlands. And well, that widespread skepticism really only fueled our curiosity here and also made us ask some quite fundamental questions, including how do people perceive peatlands and which benefits and disbenefits do they associate with them, and how do they relate this to current and potential future uses of peatlands. So to approach these questions, we undertook a series of workshops at different places in Scotland. I will say more about that in a minute. But before that, it's perhaps useful to remind us of the historical context in which the perceptions and values evolved. So if we look back in time, peat bogs always seem to have something ambivalent about them. They seem to have been ambivalent places. So archaeological evidence, for example, shows that they were used to gather plants, but there were also kind of in-between places, where people could make contact with the other world. And that's illustrated also in material and human sacrifices that have been found in peat bogs around Europe. Then in medieval times, peatlands in Scotland were mainly seen as a useful resource at the local level, although outsiders mainly saw them as wastelands. Peatlands themselves at that time remained largely unchanged until the period of the Enlightenment. And at that time, the great improvement projects began and the land was drained to make it suitable for agriculture. And then in the 18th and 19th century, at that time, the highland clearances occurred where tenants were evicted from the land to make space for sheep. That was seen as the most economic and therefore right thing to do by larger landowners. Much of the Scottish peatlands are located in areas that are affected by these clearances. And many people that were driven off the land settled in most marginal land. That land was often very boggy. So a lot of the crofting was pushed into those areas. And then with the declining economic importance of wool, the landscape was managed more for hunting of deer and crows. And that really created this, these kind of people-free wilderness landscapes that are now regarded as iconic for Scotland. And in the 20th century, the efforts to drain the land for agriculture and especially forestry continued, facilitated by, what can be considered perverse tax incentives that resulted in large-scale conversion of peatland to forestry, often to the benefit of the rich and to the expense of society as a whole. So today, large parts of Scotland's peatlands are still drained and degraded with a mix of productive uses. But as we've witnessed or could witness over the past 2 weeks in the Peatland Pavilion, there's now a paradigm shift in policy towards an interest in investment into peatland conservation and peatland restoration for biodiversity, water regulation, and for carbon benefits. Okay, so with that kind of historic view in mind, we basically set off to find out what people in Scotland today think of peat bogs. And we held a number of workshops with residents on the Western Hebrides Isle of Lewis and as well in Aberdeen. And in these workshops, we looked at people's associations, their experiences and stories, as well as the uses and perceptions of peatbogs. And we also discussed perceptions regarding peatland degradation and restoration. So among the many nuanced findings, which you can read up in a paper, I want to really focus on how the views of peatlands today are still characterized by ambivalence and by multiple perspectives, and what that might mean and imply for conservation efforts. So we've tried to summarize the main points of our research in this diagram that you can see here that shows how peatbogs can be framed in different ways. So first, there's a dichotomy between peatbogs that are seen as a cultural landscape that's dominated by human management, and peatbogs that are seen as wilderness area. But each of these views can have different normative connotations, and I'm talking a bit more about them. So, for example, peatlands as a human-dominated cultural landscape can either be seen as something positive, as land which is managed in a good way to produce multiple benefits in the form of fuel, food, and as land which is the result of traditional management and helps to keep the community spirit and the connection to the land alive. On the other hand side, others may agree that peatbogs are cultural landscapes that are dominated by human activities, but they might see this as something negative in that peatbogs should be wilderness, untouched by humans, but where human activity has now resulted in ongoing degradation, loss of peat, loss of flora and fauna, and so on. And likewise, peatbogs as wilderness can either be framed as kind of wonderful wild places that are home to unique biodiversity and that provide people with opportunities for going out for recreation and adventure in wonderful wild landscapes that are really iconic for Scotland. But conversely, peatlands as wilderness can also be seen as bleak, dangerous wastelands that should be brought under human management in order to transform them into something useful. So importantly, what we found was that these different perceptions of peatlands do not necessarily exclude each other, but they rather sit a bit uneasily side by side, and they can be held by the same person simultaneously, who then draw on and they emphasize different aspects of this frame depending on the context. So regarding the relationship between humans and nature, humans are mainly seen as a threat to nature in this wonderful wilderness and the degraded nature frames, which you can see here at the top left and bottom right. In these frames, nature is seen as inherently fragile and therefore in need of protection. And that's different from the cultural landscape and the wasteland frames, here on the top right and bottom left, where humans are seen as stewards and nature is inherently robust, but even if in the need of further management. So further, these different frames are linked to different evaluations about how the land should be used. So for example, a perception of peatlands as wastelands was often accompanied by the view that they should be used to produce food and timber. And conversely, an emphasis on peatlands as degraded nature was rather linked to protect biodiversity, to restore the peatlands. So, but it's important that these kind of seemingly conflicting uses like food production, biodiversity conservation, were often not necessarily seen as kind of diametrically opposite, but rather kind of as a question of achieving the right balance between them, either over time or over space. All right, what can we learn from this? Well, an ambition in Scotland and in many other places is to restore peatlands at a really large scale and an increasingly large scale. And that can only be successful if there's support by both local communities and by the wider public. The ambivalence in views and perceptions that we found may really point to potential areas of conflict. And the conflict may arise, in our view, if engagement with people and communication with people and communities really emphasizes specific frames, but ignores other frames. But we also found that almost all of our participants expressed a wish to balance different uses and states, and this then offers a basis for solutions that that can be more widely acceptable. So in sum, if ignored, the ambivalence in people's views can be a risk to conservation efforts, we think, but acknowledging the ambivalence and working with it can be the basis for finding ultimately effective solutions going forward. Okay, maybe a few words to finish. Since starting with our kind of socioeconomic research on peat, we've really come a long way. We've done surveys and estimated costs and benefits of restoration, investigated also motivations of people engaged in the restoration process. So we've done a lot of work around peatlands and the socioeconomics of peatlands. And with this knowledge now that we've gained over the past years, we're very excited to return to communities in peat-rich areas. And our aim there is to understand what a just transition to a low-carbon economy would mean to them, what it could mean to the peatlands that form an important part of the really cultural identity of many people living in these parts of Scotland. So based on what we've learned about the ambivalence and the views regarding the peatlands and their use, we're really keen to see if we will find similar dichotomies and ambivalence when we'll be looking into perceptions about low carbon future in these areas. Okay, that's all I wanted to say for today, and well, that kind of slide really kind of summarizes a lot of our work, which you can find on our webpage is linked to that. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Klaus. So I'll remind the online audience, you can send questions through the Q&A function. And for the audience here, we'll have a roaming mic at the end. I'd like to move on now to our second speaker, Dorothy Pritchard. Dorothy is chair of the Melness Crofters estate. So crofting, one of the land practices which Klaus has just referred to. Dorothy has a really fascinating example of both restoring and using peatlands. Dorothy, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Andrew, and thank you for inviting me today to today's event, so I can sort of share our journey about Space Hub Sutherland. I'll introduce myself first because probably most people don't know who I am. I'm Dorothy Pritchard, and I'm one of 7 directors that are tasked with running the Melness Crofters estate. Our estate is 10,700 acres on the north coast of Sutherland, and it has 60 members, which we represent. The problems we've faced really in our area is an aging population and we can't, no diversity of job opportunities for our young people who we keep losing. And that leads eventually to an unsustainable community. So we've always been looking for opportunities to sort of diversify and while protecting our land to still provide jobs for our young people. And that's what we feel Space Hub Sutherland will do. It'll sort of allow us, it'll be a good example of how development and sustainability and protecting our natural environment can all go hand in hand. So the first slide I would like to show you really is a video that we've prepared, which shows 5 key elements of the kind of actions and highlights the key environmental points that we would like to emphasize that we're taking to preserve our landscape and look after our peatland, while still managing to have the world's hopefully first carbon neutral spaceport. So if Rachel could please play the video, that would be really good. Thank you. just tell before I go on to who we are, who we are. I would just talk a little bit about that video. That's giving you an overview of what our space hub will look like. It'll be a 10-acre site out of our 10,700 acres, so it's a small footprint. It'll have the construction will include floating roads, minimum peat extraction. As you can see from the video, it's not a pristine peat bog. It's been used by generations for peat cutting. It's also got hill drains, which were installed, I think, in the 60s and 70s. And all those things form part of what we're hoping to restore. We're going to restore 76.5 hectares of peatland. Any peat that is removed during construction will be used for restoring that peatland and for blocking drains so we can re-wet the area. Nature Scottish Environmental Agency, SEPA, they've all approved the plans for the Space Hub. It's been probably one of the most scrutinised pieces of ground anywhere in Scotland. It's gone through stringent planning, a judicial review, land court hearing to make sure the crofters are being dealt with fairly. And as I said, those agencies support it. So it's had a lot of scrutiny. Is there anything else I want to say about the video? You've seen that the rocket parts, the rockets that are being used are going to be reusable. The first stage will fall back to the sea, and there's a patented retrieval system being developed by Orbex, who are in Forest, just outside Inverness, where they have their rocket factory, constructing factory. And we hope that they'll be able to retrieve that. It's happened successfully in New Zealand already. With at their first attempt at using a retrieval system, it worked. So we have great faith in that too. And the rocket will leave no space debris because they're made from a very lightweight carbon fiber, and they burn when the second part re-enters the Earth's atmosphere, it burns up. So it has sustainability in space and in the sea by not leaving any debris. And I think there's anything else. And also the rocket will use a form of biopropane that will leave less black carbon in the upper atmosphere. It's just recently Exeter University carried out a study that demonstrated the fuel that Orbex hopes to use will leave 80 or 90% less carbon in the upper atmosphere. So that's all good news as well. So then, who are we? Well, in this picture, you can see some of the directors and Wilma Robertson, our secretary, our only employee, part-time employee. So she'd probably say she's a full-time employee with part-time wages, and her family. And these are, many of us are folk who have been settled here after being moved during the clearances that you were talking about, Klaus. And we've worked the land here for generations, and that land is very important to us. It's very important to the crofters who still use it, and it's important to us, and that's why we want to ensure that we protect it. Could I see the next slide, please? Sorry, could I see the next slide, Rachel? Slide forward, history of peat. Oops, I don't know what's happened there. Hello? That's it. Okay. When I was a child in Melness, well over 50 years ago, nearly every household cut peat, and crofters relied on it for their warmth, for their fuel, and for their grazings and food. So really warmth and food, the two of the essentials of life. And they even practiced a form of restoration themselves. They replaced the turf that they cut back into the peat bags so that the flora could still grow there. And they used a series of different implements to do that. A rutter, a flatter spade, a tusk, and a hawk, as we called it, a hawking fork that put the peat back down onto the ground. So even then, crofters were aware of how important their land was to them. And I feel, and protection of it was at the forefront of their thinking. I still think that protection is still at the forefront of most true crofters thinking still today. And they know the importance of their land. And that's why such a lot of care was taken over our project, and such a lot of consultation with our Gracie's committee and those that actually use the land. And I think that was recognised by the Land Court decision. I see the next slide, slide 5, please, Rachel. A wee minute to come up. It'll come in a minute. Yes. We're now much more aware of climate change, of the important part peat plays in harnessing and holding carbon and not releasing it into the environment. And restoration is one of our main priorities in this project. You can see the space hub would be in the distance of this picture that you see here where the road goes in. And it's 2 kilometers further on in the distance. So you can see that it is not some pristine area. There's been peat cut near the main road here for generations, and restoration is really a huge part of what we hope to do to restore that land and to keep it, to help keep our environment, harness as much carbon as possible to protect our environment. And drains as well. We hope to drain that, block drains so that we can re-wet our landscape. That's part of our plan for the future. Let's see slide 6, please. In 2022, we're hoping that Melness will become the home of the world's first carbon neutral spaceport. And those things that will be achieved by all the measures that we're taking to protect our peatland. We've minimized the need to remove peat to build structures. So the actual area where the space hub has been built, as I said, isn't pristine. It's also got a schist of rock that runs through it. So it's not all deep peat. There are areas of deeper peat, and where we do have to remove that peat will be used for restoration purposes. We'll also be using floating roads, which sit on, but that's an old system that was used, our old single track road. There's a double track road now. The old single track road in the past was built as a floating road with wood underneath it, then stones, and then tar put on top. So we'll be using floating roads to access the space hub, single track with wider passing areas, and that as well will protect the peat, because the peat will still exist under the road, but will not be breaking the surface to release carbon into the atmosphere. So that's a big part of our development as well, is using those floating roads. See if I have something else I was going to speak to. We'll have the final slide, please, Rachel. The future of the people of Melness. As I've said before, our problem, in fact, it's a problem right along the north coast. I'm a retired teacher, and I've seen the falling school rolls. We have an aging demographic here, and no opportunities for our young people. A lot of what did sustain us was oil-related jobs and jobs at Dounreay, which has been decommissioned, and the oil industry contracting. And that bodes badly for our communities, because all our young people, well-educated young people, are leaving this area, and it's an unsustainable aging population. They find it hard to fill job positions in hotels, in care home that we have here, in care out in the community. It's too hard to fill those jobs, and so we really need to sort of widen our sort of horizons and think of different types of job opportunities, ones related to STEM subjects. And that's what we're aiming to do with the Space Hub, which we're hoping will provide us with about 41 jobs. and hopefully other ancillary things that will grow up around the Space Hub. So we've got a lot of hopes on that, and we want to build housing. We've already, Melness Crofters already built social housing several years ago, which has been occupied since we built it. And so we hope to do more of that as well. And while still preserving our habitats and wildlife and creating job opportunities. And our low intensity crofting practices, which are still practiced. In fact, our land is only grazed to about 30% of its capacity. So it's not an overgrazed or overused or spoilt landscape. It's a very natural landscape, and we want to keep protecting it. And that's what we aim to do with our development. So that's the end of my chat. So thank you very much for listening. And if anyone has any questions, I welcome those. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy. Just a really fascinating example of an innovative use, community-driven, for a peatland. Our next speaker is Professor Jane Barker, who is both a professor at the University of Cumbria and also the managing director of Dalefoot Composts. Jane's going to talk about a completely different and perhaps more traditional use of peat, but how that can also be innovative. Jane, are you hearing us? Yes?
Yeah, I can hear, and my video should be starting as well. Oh. Okay, are we there? Yes.
Right. I'm just gonna share.
Can you hear me, Andrew?
Yes, indeed.
Good. Okay. If we go to the first slide, please.
Hang on.
Okay. So if everyone can see that, what I'm wanting to talk about, firstly, I'd like to say thank you to Professor Millar for the invitation to present today. And I'm going to be talking about the cultures of peat, in fact, horticultural peat. And my presentation is based and built around my 20+ years of manufacturing a range of sustainable peat-free composts, as recognised last night in the Garden Industry Awards, but also my 20 years of manufacturing, of delivering sustainable peatland restoration across the UK for 22 years. And as Andrew said, I'm a professor of practice at the University of Cumbria, looking into the carbon accounting of peatland restoration and also the restoration of peatlands to functionality. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was the use of peat in horticulture and the current situation. So peat is used as a soil improver and as a growing media ingredient. Globally, the figures are not too clear, but it's anticipated that we extract a volume of peat equivalent to half that for fuel peat. So it's not the most significant use of extracted peat. Germany and Canada account for over half of the horticultural peat extraction, followed by the Baltic states, Finland and Sweden. So very much a northern hemisphere, although there is peat extraction in the southern hemisphere as well. But just to put it into context, and this is a figure that's used to defend the continued use of horticultural peat, horticultural use amounts to 0.0005% of the world peat resources and reserves. But in the UK, we use 2.3 million cubic meters of peat every year. This went up last year due to COVID, as 3 million more gardeners joined the Gardening Grow Your Own brigade, and the signs are that that will persist. So an increased number of gardeners, and important in terms of linking back to food production and health and well-being. In Scotland, we only have figures for extraction, and that was in the order of 0.5 million cubic meters per year, representing about 60% of the estimated 0.8 million cubic meters of UK production.
Jane, we can't see your slides advancing. So
you can't see, sorry, Andrew.
We can't see your slides advancing. We can just see the first slide. It's possible that you're not in presenter mode, it has been suggested to me.
Yeah.
We are in presenter mode, so I'm not sure what's... We're just having a little fiddle now.
That's great.
I'm
Thank
sorry
you.
about that.
No.
Can you see? So we're moving on to the history of peat in horticulture. Can you see that slide?
Not yet.
Right. Thank you. Is that there? It says we're
Yep.
sharing.
We now have the history of peat for horticulture in Scotland.
Yes, that's the one I want to talk about next. And sorry about that. I don't know why it dropped out.
No.
What I want to say is that it's actually a very recent history of peat use, not like fuel use domestically in Scotland. That first mentions of peat are in relation to agriculture, and that was only by the 17th century. It later came into be used much later when in the 1930s, the range of standardized blends was developed, known as the John Innes mixes. And that's when peat became much more part of the gardening landscape, still referred to today, those John Innes mixes. It was after the war that we saw a significant use of peat in horticulture as crop production dominated, given the sensitivity around food production and a nation's ability to feed itself. And in the 1970s, the growth of amateur gardening, when people took to their gardens to produce food and flowers. So moving on to the next slide, I hope you can see why is peat used as growing media. Can you see that? Yeah.
No, not at the moment.
No, it's not. Right. Okay, so what I just want to say is, while that slide is being brought to the screen, there are two important note points to note. Peat is not a traditional growing medium, as we've just recognised through history. And in fact, that peat is not a good growing medium because it requires additional nutrients to perform as a growing media. So it has to have lots of additives. But it does have attributes which make it an attractive element for gardeners and for the producers of growing media. It holds up to 20 times its weight in water. It helps the reduction of leaching of nutrients. It's relatively sterile. It's weed, chemical and disease free. It has soil buffering capacities. It's relatively uniform and therefore a good basis from which to produce composts. It's relatively cheap, but that's not including the environmental costs, of course. And it's light in weight and relatively cheap to transport. So all those things combine to make peat a particularly attractive material for horticulture. Can we move on to that? So if I move on while we try to get the screen working. So now we get into some of the more interesting aspects of peatland in horticulture. Why are gardeners, in particular Scottish gardeners, so committed to using peat? And I'm sure we're at a tipping point of change here through stick and carrot. And I have looked at two aspects which influence the persistence and continued use of peat in horticulture. Firstly, those are the individuals, when we look at why individual gardeners continue to use peat. And some of it relates to some of the words and things that Dorothy was referring to. Culturally, along with many other aspects of Scottish, if not British culture, we cling to our rights of turbary and commons. And as a common user in the Lake District, I am fully familiar with what that all means. But we also, as a culture, persist with the freedom of choice and the rights to use whatever that resource might be. We have a perception of how extensive peatlands are and that they are a natural supply of Scottish peat resource, and why shouldn't we use them? They're also, and that is backed up by collective consumer behaviours persisting through the media, a lack of confidence in the alternatives and very poor initial peat-free composts, and the lack of availability and price, of course. Now, if we look on the other side, the supply side, the business is dominated by two very large manufacturers of peat-based compost, that's ICL and Westland, who operate large-scale extraction sites in Scotland, some not very far from Glasgow, in fact. And they are heavily invested in peat production, supplied peat for years, and have looked towards bringing to the market reduced peat composts. There's a resistance to change, the economics come into play, And it's only in the last 5 to 10 years that we've begun to see a volume of replacements with particular credentials that have been established. And it's important to acknowledge that across Europe, the attitudes to peat is very different. And there is a strong view that horticulture is simply is the scapegoat in the peatland world, similarly in North America. So what is the current scale of extraction? Just so that we have some sort of idea, we can see here some Scottish figures that I've managed to pull together. So the scale of extraction is there, but I think the one thing I want to draw attention to is that this extraction and composting of peat only directly employs 85 full-time equivalents. That was the last basis of review in 2014, and I'm sure it's much less now. Bear in mind that peat extraction is subject to planning law and that it's very expensive to defend refusals through appeal, and a lot of the extractions go without restoration plans or even a bond to ensure extraction. What's the government policy on the use of peat in horticulture? Well, this Conservative government in England, their preference is for free market regulation and a voluntary approach. And that is indeed what was followed in 2011 when they set a voluntary phasing out of peat by 2020, obviously a target that was missed. But this year, the government brought forward its intention to ban peat use by gardeners by the end of Parliament, again hoping to encourage voluntary shift and plant nurseries by 2030. And the government has also initiated with the industry a responsible sourcing initiative to enable the quantification and qualification of some of the alternatives. What about peat-free then? Well, moving forward, we need to recognise those market factors determining supply and the dominance of the small numbers of suppliers. But there is a looming space in the market along with opportunities. And this is already happening through the manufacture of compost using carbon capture crops. Our composts here at Dalefoot are actually using carbon capture crops. And this provides opportunities for alternative modes of organisation of production, particularly relevant to rural areas where communities of interest companies are emerging, small, locally based manufacturer with a less carbon footprint, but providing significant social and economic employment. The mechanisms to support this innovation are in place, but funding and investment are really the rate limiting factors here. Are we moving on then? I believe we are at that tipping point, and it is now actually peat-free and beyond. It's no longer simply peat-free horticulture. It's now about the culture and practice of sustainable gardening and horticulture, with carbon being a major consideration, along with social and economic considerations, but plastic, water, and other things becoming of great concern to gardeners. So I'd like to leave you with 2 or 3 thoughts that I have on this in particular. Do we need a new culture for gardening and horticulture? And again, that build has the possibilities of building on some of the things that Dorothy talked about the stewarding of our resources, our relationship to the land and taking care of it, and perhaps move to that reduce, reuse, recycle in gardening. Even with compost, I believe that is the way forward. We do not need to use as much as we have done, and we need to move away from consumerism in this particular aspect of horticulture. And we can take and flip that culture out there. Our peatlands are our rights and our culture, and has been so graphically demonstrated through COP26, through other cultures across the globe. I'm sure that we can do this here on our doorstep. And certainly there is an opportunity to engage our gardeners in accounting for their carbon footprint through their desire to garden, grow food. And so whilst in the use of peatlands is a small step, actually the multiplier effect can take it beyond peatland in gardening and achieve more climate change gardening. How will it do that? Well, we have to get the messaging straight. We have to assist this through clear, developed climate change impact messaging about growing media, about composts in particular, but about horticulture generally. And we have to continue to support and develop new horticultural training and driving those messages through the gardening media. And I think that's everything for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. Sorry. Thank you. So Jane's showing there that people are not just acting as consumers, that there's a way of thinking about gardening sustainably and being a sustainable user and contributor to those systems of composting and reuse and even recycling. Our next speaker is Dr. Rebecca Arts. Rebecca is the research leader for restoration and adaptive management at the James Hutton Institute. She's worked on peatland restoration in several different contexts, including in the context of domestic extraction. Rebecca, are you hearing us? We can see you on the screen.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for this wonderful opportunity to talk in this event on peatland rights and cultures in the first ever peatland pavilion at COP. It's a real privilege to be here. Are you able to see my slides?
Not quite yet, but they're coming. Yes, we see them now.
Thank you. So recognizing that this event is on peatland rights and cultures, clearly we need to balance cultural and also existential needs of communities associated with peatland users. But we need to balance that against our knowledge that we are in a climate crisis where every ton of carbon dioxide counts. My job as a scientist is to present the current evidence and point out uncertainties in our understanding. So with this in mind, I was asked to present on the current greenhouse gas emissions as they are currently reported in the UK greenhouse gas inventory in the wider global context from industrial and domestic peat extraction. So this is a talk jointly with Dr. Hannah Kilvert, who is at the LULUCF reporting team at UKCAH. So a short bit of context, the international reporting instruments in the UK greenhouse gas inventory relate to the 2006 IPCC guidelines in general terms. I'm not sure if my screen has advanced. Can you just check that for me? Yes, it's just sorry, I'm trying to check the live talk, but there's a bit of a delay. Okay, so that's working fine. So in general terms, the inventories internationally follow the same guidance. So there are IPCC guidelines for general methodology of reporting, which most inventories currently use. However, for peatlands specifically, a 2013 supplement to the guidelines was published by the IPCC, which national greenhouse gas inventories with significant amount of wetlands are supposed to use. And this supersedes some of the guidance from 2006 for on-site emissions. And hopefully it will become clear what I mean by this in a moment. For countries with high proportions of peatlands, such as the UK and other northern countries, the use of higher tiers of emission reporting is recommended. So for the UK, I was fortunate enough to be part of a team to calculate these higher tier emission factors for the on-site emissions from peatlands, and which now have been implemented as per that report led by Chris Evans et al. At UKCH. So briefly, what is included in reporting in the UK and other international greenhouse gas inventories? Well, basically everything. So the idea is that the entire life cycle of emissions is reported on. And in the case of extraction, this includes land conversion in preparation for extraction. So the drainage, as well as the removal of any vegetation biomass, which is clearly different in an industrial versus domestic setting. The emissions resulting from the extraction process itself, so that should include the emissions from machinery, any stockpiling emissions, any use of the extracted peat itself, so the combustion in an energy context or oxidation in terms of emissions resulting from horticultural peat use, and finally the after use of the site, whether it is abandoned, restored, or converted to any other land use. So this is a bit of a complex slide, and I've taken a lot of detail out of this, but this is just to briefly show, in the left column, you see the kinds of activities that are included in the inventory, as I just explained, the on-site emissions, stockpiling, combustion and oxidation. And for each of these sectors, what is taken into consideration are the emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, as well as nitrous oxide, and that includes the on-site emissions from the land itself and also from ditches, but also losses into waterways of dissolved and particulate carbon, plus any potential wildfire emissions that can be directly attributed to these areas. So it's quite a complex amount of work to compile this in an inventory context. So going back to what others have already reported on, industrial peat extraction is very much a European and Canadian activity. I put some data in which others have already mentioned, so I won't go into that. Communications with the International Peat Society last week at the COP suggested that the current extractions volumes are lower than what is represented here on this slide. However, as also Jane already mentioned, UK's usage at the moment is somewhere between 1.5 to 2.3 million cubic meters, of which around 0.75 million cubic meters are still extracted in Northern Ireland, Scotland, and England. However, all of that is concentrated around just a few sites, as already Jane had mentioned. So in the inventory at the moment, what is captured is 8,000 hectares of industrial extraction sites at this moment in time. As I mentioned, the life cycle emissions are incorporating everything. So when we're talking about industrial extraction, on top of the direct losses from the peat itself, as it's extracted for either energy use or for horticultural use, which in inventory terms is allocated to the year of extraction, it's assumed that horticultural peat carbon is completely lost in the year of extraction and sales, which may or may not be true. It's one of these uncertainties, but you have to use a common methodology. There is very significant and actually higher impact due to the loss of the vegetation and subsurface drainage. And in the longer run, such harvested areas do not naturally regenerate and require active rehabilitation efforts. So to juxtapose that against ongoing domestic extraction, here's an example from Scotland. In the data that we have been able to use, because there's very little spatial data around, date back to aerial imagery from the 1980s, which indicate presence of peat cutting features historically, not current activity of extraction. But in a sense, that doesn't matter to the great degree, because realistically, the emissions, as Jane and others have pointed out, including also Dorothy and Klaus, current use for energy needs is relatively small. So what we're looking at in terms of the challenge of reducing emissions are the historic peat extraction sites, which due to the ongoing drainage that peat banks represent are quite substantial. So if you see here, it's a very small proportion on the left-hand side. You can barely see where these extraction areas are relative to the landmass of peat in brown here in Scotland. But if we look into this in a bit more detail, there are historic peat banks in pretty much all rural locations of Scotland. And that amounts to around 136 kilohectares. So a much larger land area to consider relative to the 8,000 hectares, which are indicated here in blue, of the handful of historic and active extraction sites. I've refrained from showing which ones are active versus historical at this, so please bear that in mind. Not all of these are active. The issue with domestic extraction is partly historical, but also that best practice is not always adhered to. So the use of putting the vegetated surface back onto the bottom of the cutting face is not always adhered to, and also not all locations really limit the depth of the peat banks. What this can lead to, and has led to, is a very extensive use where peat bodies are extracted from the edges, and the resulting drainage causes significant emissions because of the larger scale effects that then accumulates to. So to put a story to an end, the total currently reported emissions in the UK inventory from peat extraction amount to 2.3 megatons of carbon dioxide. That actually puts the peat extraction sector as a whole as the third highest contributor to the UK emissions from peatland, which in total are reported as 19 megatons in 2019. Now, that total of 2.3 megatons splits into around 75% from peat fuel sites, i.e. domestic extraction. But as I said earlier, that relates to largely historic drainage impacts. A very small component is still actively extracted. And in fact, we don't even currently include these very small emissions from the burning of that domestic peat because we don't have data on the actual volumes, but it's likely to be very small. However, the remaining 25% of the total peat extraction emissions relate to a very small area, the 8 kilohectares of historic and active industrial extraction sites. So to reiterate one point, although current use is located in a handful of sites, both in domestic and in industrial terms, the real issue is the after-use emissions. So sites with significant historic, domestic or industrial extraction don't self-heal. The continued effects of the drainage, and also in cases of bare peat from industrial areas, self-sterilization of any seeds lead to long-term emissions. They do not regenerate naturally. So to summarize this talk, notwithstanding some uncertainties, historic and active peat extraction is currently reported as the third highest contributor to UK peatland emissions from a very small proportion of our total peatland area. We know that best practice is not always adhered to, so maybe this is worth reiterating where this is still ongoing. But where industrial extraction is still ongoing or abundant, active restoration plans should be considered to mitigate the considerable long-term emissions. So thank you very much for your time today, and thanks also to the other speakers in this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Rebecca. So what we see there is that these historically extracted sites are still emitting really a significant amount of carbon. But many different groups have the right to extract. And it's to those rights that we turn next with Dr. Andrew Jackson from Dublin. Andrew's a lawyer. And so he's going to talk to us about the legal context of turbery, the right to cut peat. Andrew, are you hearing us?
I am. Thank you very much. I hope you can see my cover slide there. So I'm going to be talking about domestic peat extraction in Ireland, and just very briefly following on from Rebecca's presentation, just to clarify in the Irish context, the juxtaposition is a little bit different, I suppose. The contrast is not between domestic extraction and industrial, because in fact, almost all of the domestic extraction in Ireland is now done by heavy machinery. And so it's sometimes difficult, as I'll say later, I'll quote later, it's difficult to distinguish between industrial, semi-industrial and domestic extraction as such, because the domestic extraction is done by machines. And the end game for a raised bog in Ireland that is subject to domestic extraction is shown here in this aerial image of a bog in County Galway. You can see the raised bog has been eaten away on all sides by the turbery plots. Now, as you all know, Ireland has internationally important raised bogs and blanket bogs and very extensive peatland soil areas amounting to about 1/5 of Ireland's entire land territory. And it's maybe interesting to note why Ireland has historically been so heavily reliant on peat and why peat is still used so extensively. And there are several different reasons for that, but two that I'll mention. One is the relative absence of domestic fossil fuel resources, so little domestic coal, oil, or gas. And also the fact that Ireland, during the period of British rule, was almost totally deforested, as you can see here. So Ireland was deforested to supply the demands of the British Empire, amongst other things, and to help, for example, rebuild London after the Great Fire. So you can see that by 1925, Ireland had just 1% tree cover. So in the absence of fossil fuel resources, in the absence or the dwindling access to timber as a resource, Ireland turned to its peatlands. And even although the percentage of forest cover has grown, as you can see, to about 11%, today, that's still the lowest tree cover in Europe. So if we look at it today, Ireland extracts peat for various purposes, and I won't cover all of them, but here are a few. Until very recently, Ireland had 3 peat-fired power stations generating electricity, which together burnt about 3 million tons of peat per year. Now, the extraction for this purpose, which was by a semi-state peat company, ended in 2020. 2 of the 3 power stations have recently closed. The final station will either close or move away from peat in the next couple of years. And the bogland that was used to fuel these stations is to be rehabilitated. So that is a good news story in the peatland context in Ireland, what is now beginning to happen to these state-owned bogs. Horticulture and export for horticulture and other uses, the majority of which goes to the UK, is also a major use of peat in Ireland. Ireland, as you may or may not know, also has a very large mushroom production sector, and peat is used for casing in mushroom production. So that's another major use we have. A third is as bedding, as a climate double whammy, as bedding for cattle. And this rises, for example, in years of drought when there's poor access to straw. And the final use that I'll mention, which is really the focus when we're talking about domestic peat extraction in the Irish context, is the use of peat as fuel for domestic heating. And here's the juxtaposition I mentioned at the outset, the postcard image of traditional hand-cut turf versus the modern reality of domestic peat extraction, which is almost exclusively done by heavy machinery, done by contractors. And that's why I say you can't really contrast industrial versus domestic in the Irish context, because the domestic is an industry operated by contractors, by turbulent rights holders, and so on. For anyone who's unfamiliar with the process of domestic peat extraction, this is an aerial image of a special area of conservation, priority habitat, active raised bog, Monavea in County Galway, and you can see the digger operates up at the face, loads the peat into a spreading machine drawn by a tractor, which drives along and extrudes these long strips of peat, which are then left to dry and are then broken and footed, stacked up and left to dry, and then collected for burning in the winter. If we turn briefly to the law, so large numbers of households in Ireland have so-called turbulent rights, which is a traditional right to extract and remove peat for household use. It's a very complex area of the law. The resulting picture is the sort of map you see in the bottom right, where you may have multiple freehold owners, and then you may overlain on that, you may have hundreds potentially of turbary plots. You can see the bog here sliced up into individual little slices. But to say that somebody has a turbary right isn't the end of the story, because in many cases, peat extraction also needs planning permission, and as part of that process, an impact assessment or assessments may need to be done under the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive and under the EU Habitats Directive. And to cut a long story short, and this is interesting, I think, in the context of Rebecca's image showing Ireland as the #1 producer in Europe in terms of peat extraction by volume, virtually all peat extraction in Ireland, and I'm talking about from semi-state company to large multinational companies, right down to private individuals, virtually all peat extraction in Ireland is unpermitted and unassessed. So consumers who are buying Irish peat, for example, in the United Kingdom, horticultural producers who are using Irish peat and so on. That peat is unpermitted, unassessed, not extracted in accordance with the law. In terms of scale, so until the end of the Second World War, most of the extraction in Ireland was by hand. But it's important, I think, when we talk about the climate and biodiversity emergency, not to romanticize hand cutting versus machine cutting. And you can see the quote from Ireland's National Parks and Wildlife Service here. Around 93% of the decline in the area of raised bogs in Ireland is due to peat extraction and associated drainage, approximately 70% attributable to hand cutting over many centuries. And if you look now to the table on the left, in the peak year for cutting 1926, which coincided with the lowest forest cover in Ireland, more than 6 million tons of peat cut by hand, which is twice what the 3 peat-fired power stations were using. And in fact, you can see all throughout the period to 1950, the amount being cut by hand was above that amount. Now, that's not to say that mechanized cutting is not also a problem. It's an enormous problem. It's caused enormous damage too. The mechanization of the cutting, which intensified in Ireland from the 1980s, and the use of contractors, again, this is another quote from the National Parks and Wildlife Service, make it difficult, as I emphasised at the outset, to distinguish really between domestic and semi-commercial cutting in the Irish context. Now, but just for my remaining 2 or 3 minutes, I just wanted to touch on a case study which I think has some interesting lessons for climate policy more generally and for just transition. So Ireland has had an issue over the last decades with the extraction of peat from Natura 2000 sites, from the most important conservation areas in Ireland for peatlands. Here is Ballynafa in County Kildare, and you can see the turbary plots all around the margin. You can see drains, you can see burning impacts, you can see forestry impacts. Here's Moods Bog in County Kildare. You can see the blue boundary is the boundary of the special area of conservation. And you can see in particular around the margins to the north and east and south, you can see the impacts of domestic extraction. In the bottom right there, you can see diggers operating at Moods Bog. The fact that this activity doesn't have planning permission, has not been subject to appropriate assessment under the Habitats Directive, it's been ongoing. And there's a long story there. But Ireland has tried to introduce, or has introduced a scheme to try to bring an end to this activity within the raised bog SACs. And the most recent scheme was in 2011. And as part of that scheme, turf cutters, peat extractors were offered either a financial package of about 22,000 euros to stop, or the opportunity to be relocated to an undesignated bog and to have the right to keep extracting peat. Now, that doesn't address the climate crisis, of course, nor does it really address the biodiversity crisis, but it at least would mean that people were not extracting from the most important conservation areas. Most of those who've applied for the scheme have taken the financial package. About 10% have opted for relocation, and the total cost of the scheme is about 5 million euros per year since 2011. But the interesting broader lesson, I think, or the broader questions that this raises are raised by the fact that despite the opportunity to have either financial compensation or the right to go somewhere else and be given a plot to allow you to keep extracting, some peat extractors have not availed of this and have insisted on continuing extracting peat from the raised bog special areas of conservation, such that, and that's been ongoing every year, but the most recent figures released under Freedom of Information rules show that 18 of the raised bog, about 1/3 of the raised bog special areas of conservation are still subject to extraction, about 300 plots in total. And you might think, well, that's a relatively small number of plots, but of course, these 18 bogs are being drained on a continuing basis to allow the peat extraction to happen. So there's a fairly significant climate impact there. So this is my final slide. The questions of broader relevance for climate policy raised here, I think, are what can be done when, as Bullock and Collier put it well, I think, when the public good conflicts with a preference for unsustainable behavior. Given the option of going somewhere else and leaving these sites alone, people have opted to not to do that and to continue. And what to do when the rule of law proves ineffective. And you can see from the headlines here, it's widely reported that this is happening. The bottom left image from the Irish Times, the Gardaí, the police in Ireland fail to gain access as turf cutting restarts on a protected site in the West. And in fact, the one time that the Gardaí tried to go in and confiscate machinery when the turf cutting was ongoing, that resulted in a standoff between armed police and turf cutters, an overnight standoff, and the police backed off in the end. Now, one part of the answer may be, for example, community-led restoration projects, and Ireland has done great work in that regard. Part of the answer might be, well, to say, well, this is generational, and as time goes on, it won't be such an issue. But we don't have the luxury of time, of course, in the case of climate and biodiversity crisis. So I'd be really interested to hear from other panelists and people in the audience if they have any ideas about how to deal with this thorny problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. I think enforcement of environmental law wasn't probably where we thought that we'd be going with this session, but it's really fascinating that is exactly where you've ended up in Ireland, with a standoff with the police on the edge of the bog. So thank you very much indeed for that contribution. We're lastly going to move to Canada, where Dr. Lorna Harris is a researcher for the University of Alberta and also for Wildlife Conservation Canada. Lorna, are you hearing us?
Hi there, yes, and you can all see my screen there. I can see it on your screen, that's good. So yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. I was very happy to get the invitation, partly because although I've been in Canada for just over 10 years now, I did start my interest in peatlands in Scotland, where I worked for SEPA as a wetland ecologist. So everything that has just been presented right now is very familiar to me. So first, before I begin, I'm just going to acknowledge that I'm speaking today from Canada, which is part of Turtle Island. This is a land occupied, travelled and cared for by Indigenous peoples since time immemorial. And then I'm speaking from Edmonton in Alberta. This is a traditional meeting ground and travelling route of the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene and Nakota Sioux. And this is the Indigenous perspective on peatlands in Canada is going to feature in my slides going forward. When I think it's quite a different perspective to what we've heard from the UK and Ireland so far. So peatlands across Canada, we have a large proportion of the world's peatlands. 1/4 of the world's peatlands are here in Canada. It's around 1.1 million square kilometres. These coincide with large tracts of intact forest as well across the boreal of Canada. So you can see here the peatlands covering the whole, spanning across all of Canada, across all of the provinces and territories. This is a significant carbon stock. Around 28% of the global peatland carbon stock is in Canada. So this is a very significant responsibility for Canada. And we also have the world's second largest expanse of peatland in the world. The area outlined here in purple is the Hudson Bay lowland in Northern Ontario, spanning across to Quebec and also to Manitoba. This area is bigger than the entire landmass of the UK and Ireland, and it is 90% peatland, storing a significant portion of the peatland carbon in Canada. So peatlands across Canada are part of really vast and remote intact landscapes. This photograph showing from a helicopter a view of the Hudson Bay lowlands, just showing, you know, to the very horizon, you can see it's all different peat, raised bogs, fens, water tracks, a huge mosaic of peatlands. Some other examples here on the left, photo of forested peatlands in Alberta, and then also again treed peatlands in another little part of the Hudson Bay lowlands there. So these peatlands across Canada, they are in remote landscapes, but that doesn't mean that there aren't people there and that people don't have an interest in these landscapes. I'm showing here a map of treaties, historical treaty boundaries for Canada. These were all established, you know, around the time of colonization of Canada with Indigenous peoples as Europeans moved into Canada. And you can see that these boundaries for each of the treaties don't follow the provincial boundaries necessarily. And this is an important thing to just think about when we're going forward with the Indigenous perspective here. So we also have modern treaties in Canada. Some of these were, you know, in the early 2000s. I think one of them, the Cree Nation Governance Agreement there in Quebec, was as recent as 2018. So these are still ongoing issues with Indigenous governance and land rights in Canada. And this is an important aspect for peatland protection and management in Canada. And I can't speak more on these issues. I'm not an Indigenous person. I'm just a peatland scientist with experience working in these landscapes. So I'm going to direct you here to a talk that we did in a session in the Peatland Pavilion on Monday. And I urge you all to go and listen to Vern Chichu from the Mushkegowuk Council to listen to him speak on how important these lands are for Indigenous people and his experiences of the land and what that means to him. So I urge you to go to listen to Vern speak there. So Indigenous-led conservation and stewardship is a very important way forward for peatland protection in Canada and peatland management. I'm highlighting a map here from a Northern Peatland Story Map. You can access that through the WCS Canada website. It's an interactive map. You can see that a lot of these IPCAs overlap with peatland areas. Peatlands are a very important part of these landscapes. And you can go in there and look and find further information on these landscapes. I'm highlighting two examples here where there are videos provided by the First Nations. Also, again, highlighting the importance of these landscapes to them, in their role in stewarding and protecting them for millennia. So I urge you to follow the links on this to go and have a look. There's Bishtu Lake here, which is in the Northwest Territories. And I've included Kitchener-Makusa in Nunavut, not very good at pronouncing it, and that's in Northern Ontario as well. And two excellent videos there, just two examples of what you can find from following that story map link. So we also have a lot of peat extraction in Canada. It's only one of the many disturbances affecting peatlands in Canada. I don't have time in this short talk to talk about the impacts of permafrost thaw on communities and infrastructure and access, the impact of wildfire on communities, and people being evacuated from their homes, people losing their homes because of fires in Canada. I don't have time to talk about it. It is a significant issue that does need to be discussed. But I am going to go back to peat extraction because I knew that this was something that everybody else would be focusing on. And as mentioned previously, Canada does have a very large peat extraction industry. Although looking at the numbers that Rebecca provided just before, I think the area impacted that's in our greenhouse gas reporting in the national report is a little bit less than what's actually in there for the UK, which is quite interesting. So these landscapes have been mined for peat for, since colonization, I guess, since, this became an industry in Canada. There are significant impacts. but we're also seeing some pushback from communities here as well. And I've included just some headlines from it was just this year, a recent news article from Northern Saskatchewan, where Indigenous communities, other community members and conservationists highlighting the importance of the muskeg, which is a term for peatlands here in Canada. They're highlighting the importance of this and opposing opening up huge areas of what is pristine peatland and boreal forest to peat extraction, to further peat extraction, which is essentially for horticulture. And this peat extraction leads to a loss of irrecoverable carbon. It isn't a sustainable industry in that sense. This carbon takes centuries to millennia to recover. I think the company for this Northern Saskatchewan proposal highlighted that they would be able to regain the carbon lost in around 1,500 years. So that is really not helpful for us given our climate crisis right now. So just highlighting that this issue is also happening in Manitoba. First Nations in Manitoba have also opposed peat extraction within those territories. But it's also not the biggest impact on peatlands in Canada. We have other things impacting peatlands, such as open pit mining and infrastructure development, also oil exploration, seismic lines for oil and gas exploration. But I'm going to focus on mining just briefly here. This is the Ring of Fire development. It is a huge area of critical minerals in the Hudson Bay lowland. So this area, as I mentioned before, is 90% peatland. This is mostly pristine, intact peatland. And this proposed development is over 2,000 square kilometers for the mining claims. That doesn't include, I think, the access roads, the huge access roads that would be needed to get there, because there are no roads to this region. So this is a significant development that would have significant impacts on peatlands in this area. And the photograph on the right is just showing an existing diamond mine in the Hudson Bay lowlands and the impact that that has on these peatlands here. This mine is now closed, but it is still, it still had an impact on the peatlands there. So mining is a significant concern for peatlands in Canada. Just this week as well, it was very interesting as we were presenting the importance of the peatlands in Canada and the issues potentially with the Ring of Fire development in this area. The Ontario government announced a huge push for the Ring of Fire development to support the extraction of minerals that would support electric vehicle development. So they did that on Monday at the same time as we were talking about this, at the same time as a climate conference, with no mention of the potential climate impacts from the impacts to peatlands in that region. This region is also home to many First Nations, and the discussions about the Ring of Fire development in First Nations, discussions is probably not the right word, but this has been ongoing for quite some time. There has been a significant amount of pressure from First Nations, a lot of pushback on what is a lack of consultation and a lack of respect for Indigenous land rights in this region when it comes to mining developments. So I've just highlighted a few of the news articles, and you can go through that and go back in time several years to see how this has played out over time. And this, I think, is going to become just more significant as we go on, as we push for more electric vehicles as well, and the unfortunate overlap of having some minerals in such a carbon-rich landscape, globally important carbon-rich landscape, the same as the Congo Basin, the Amazon rainforest. So this is going to be quite a significant thing. So there are some solutions to this issue. We have thought about different policy approaches to address some of these issues, and we published a policy brief on Monday as well that highlights some of these policy approaches and other issues. That is included in detail in that document, and I can send anyone a copy of that if they would like to see it. The document itself and all of the work that we've done around this is based on a paper that is due to be published early next week. That was written by peatland scientists in university and government on highlighting all of these issues, the gaps in the research, the gaps in the policy, and what we need to do going forward. All of that is based on that extensive research. So I'm going to just end there. There's a lot more work to do on this for Canada. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Lorna. So, folks, as we have 1 minute left, I'm going to relieve Anne Gray of the Heather Trust, who we were going to have moderating a discussion, of her moderation duties. And as she had kindly provided the moderator's script, I'm going to just warn the speakers we're going to jump to the end of Anne's script, where she is challenging each of you to summarize in 2 or 3 words what you see as the most important elements of the relationship between peatland and people going forward in the future. So 3 words, the most important thing in the relationship between peatland and people. And Klaus, I'm going to start with you because, in fact, you had a slide in which those words were all summarized. So can you pick 3 for us, Klaus?
Say listening, recognition, and value.
Thank you. And Dorothy, 3 words. Dorothy, we're not hearing you, but we'll come back to you in...
Sometimes I'm muted, sorry.
No, there we go.
Again.
Yes, go for it. 3 words there, Dorothy.
Environment, preservation, and future generations.
Terrific.
I know it's 4, I'm just cheating.
Yep, that's okay. Future generations, we'll take it as 1. Yeah. Jane.
Balance is one.
Reconnection, balance, and sustainable gardening, which is 4, I know, but the last one.
Okay, yeah, no, sustainable gardening was a phrase you used before. Rebecca.
We'll hyphenate them.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Consider climate impacts.
There we go. Yep, and they make sense in a phrase. Andrew.
I'm going to go with partnership, justice, and ecology.
Yeah. Yep. Not Gardaí. And Lorna.
I would go with respect, knowledge, and climate.
Thank you. Anne, you get the last word, or the last 3 words.
Do I get 3? Okay, I would say evolution, cooperation, and facilitation.
Thank you all. And with those 15 words or phrases to end us, I'd like you to join me in thanking all of our speakers for peatland rights and cultures. And we look forward to hearing more from this strand of thinking in our future COPs and in future conferences. Thank you all.